UN Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you.
You just presented the 2022 Financing for Sustainable Development report, saying it comes at a critical moment for humanity. Can you tell me your greatest global concerns and also some of the key findings from the report?
Well, thank you. Yes, it has come at a critical time. We are facing sort of a multitude of crises, the climate, the pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine. And the financing piece of this really just comes to demonstrate how the recommendations over the years are even more needed today. And you'll see that some of those recommendations speak to the framing around the financial divide that we see in the world today. Those who have and should have a financial architecture to make access to finance more equitable hasn't happened. We've seen that in the pandemic. So where we see there should be more access to finance for developing countries, more for technology, more for the transitions in energy and in agriculture, we haven't seen that. We didn't see it in the pandemic when we were looking for vaccines and for that to be for everyone. We had a facility, so the paraphernalia was there, but we were not able to direct the resources that everyone could be vaccinated. And we're seeing more now that when countries are trying to build back better, access to credit has also become a barrier. So many of the recommendations are about access to finance. They're about better tax systems. They're about addressing illicit financial flows. But they're also about taking cognizance of the debt that is mounting and that the crisis that is exacerbating it.
How worried are you?
Extremely worried. We've just come out of the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. And, you know, while there have been some useful signs to see existing mechanisms and perhaps one or two new tools that have been put in the toolkit, there's not enough recognition that the urgency and the scale of the investments that need to happen right now should happen. And that therefore worries me that when countries are deprived of the necessary resources that are needed for health, for education, for social protection systems, that causes instability in other countries. And that instability can come from social unrest, it can come from debt collapses, and that means that the whole of the world will be far worse off than they are now, if that could be imaginable.
What needs to be done to address this inequality?
I think first we need to really find the political will to put those actions and resources behind the words that we have heard. Everyone is in agreement that the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals, 17 of them, need to be achieved for humanity, and we need to address the issues of the planet with climate change. But there just does not seem to be the movement for the $4.1 trillion we need every year to succeed with the 2030 Agenda. The vehicles are there. Perhaps some of them need to be fine-tuned to take on more resources to get them to where it's needed. Perhaps we need to look a little more at the way we de-risk environments, that very often it's catch-22. There is a conflict, and sometimes those conflicts are in parts of a country, not in the whole of a country. So how do you get resources in when, in fact, the risk profile of the country would not look that way? We do need to increase more fiscal space for countries, and that needs champions, those who understand that when we speak about development finance, it's not charity, it's investment. It's investment in people, it's investment, a vested interest, and an investment for the rest of the world. So as a globe, so interconnected, you cannot, we see the war in Ukraine, it is impacting the whole world. And that in itself should teach us that we need to bring countries up to a space where they are more resilient and can deal with these shocks, and that we don't affect the whole world.
The Ukraine war, what can be done? The Secretary General is having meetings with President Putin, with President Zelensky. How can he help bring an end to it?
Well, absolutely right. The impact on food, on finance, on energy is beyond the neighborhood of the war in Ukraine, is global. And so therefore the Secretary General's trip to Russia, his discussions with President Putin are about exactly the impacts of this war on Ukraine there needs to be peace. It needs to stop now, and make those impressions of the need to stop that aggression. And those issues are apparent now. We're seeing in the markets that today wheat is more expensive than oil. So we really need to bring an end to the war. The suffering is untold. I mean, this is going to go on for months and perhaps years after. The destruction and the number of people that have had to flee. So the implications, the impact, the consequences are huge. And I think those are the impressions that the SG would have made on President Putin. He will then, of course, discuss those issues when he gets to Ukraine with President Zelensky. And hopefully, try to bring this war to an end. This is what it's about. Every angle that we can find to engage, to dialogue, to bring peace is what we need to do.
Do you think that the world could have done more to actually stop the war before it even started?
Well, hindsight is 20/20 vision. Of course, there are things that we could have done to stop the war, but perhaps those are going to be lessons learned again when the Security Council, the General Assembly leaders will look back and say, what could we have done, and make sure that we prevent the next war, the next pandemic. These are all things that we are learning. I think history tells us that we're not very good learners when it comes to that. But, I think that this was so unimaginable, unexpected that we'd have this kind of a war in Europe. This 75 years later I think has been a big shock to the system. So I hope that the learnings will find ways to make us more accountable, to put in the checks and balances that this doesn't ever happen again, and that we are working towards peace. And back to your questions on development, if we are not investing in development, which is investing in peace, then these issues will come to the surface, and you will find many underlying causes for conflicts that we have seen around the world.
You talk of the Security Council there, and President Zelensky addressed them recently, but he actually questioned the relevance of it, and there's no action that they can take because Russia, of course, is a permanent member. Is there a case now for urgent reform?
Well, the question of reform of the Security Council is a member state issue. This is something that they have been grappling with for a very long time, and I think they will continue to address that. And there are conversations and resolutions that will be put forward to see how one can do better than we have been able to do, and to put in the checks and balances to protect the Charter. That's the most important thing, the Charter that promises the people that we would not see a war again as we did in World War II.
How relevant is an organisation like the United Nations to the wider world, to the public that don't quite understand what more you can do?
That's a good question, because my children ask me, so it's not so far from us on the outside looking inside. It must be very frustrating. But if we didn't have the UN today, we'd have to recreate it tomorrow. It is the global town hall for our global village. We are so interconnected today that that's not going to change. And we need a space where we can come and we can speak to the issues, human rights, our development, our conflicts. And, some days we'll have a voice that's loud, and some days it's not very loud. Some days we will make movement, some days we will not. But the most vulnerable of countries needs this space. Smaller countries, if they didn't have this space, we wouldn't know what would be happening out there in the big wide world. So I think we have to do better to explain why it is that we work every day between the reality, which sometimes is not very good as it is today, but the aspirations, which are really amazing. They are wonderful aspirations around frameworks for peace, frameworks for human rights, and for the development goals. And that's what we try to close, that gap between the reality and the aspirations every day. Doesn't sound, exactly what they want to hear on the outside, particularly with young people who are always in a hurry to get to where they need to get to with their aspirations. But I can tell you that this is an institution gone today, we will recreate it tomorrow. But we might not do so with the same ambitions given, the tensions that we have in the world. So let's keep what we've had. Let's protect this space for those who have the smaller voices and who would be so much worse off if there wasn't this town hall.
And what more would you like to see global leaders and governments do to maintain peace and sustainable development for the future? And how important is multilateralism today, do you think?
Well, I think, multilateralism over the last few years has been under considerable stress. We thought with the pandemic there would be global solidarity on a virus that put a stop on the world. We didn't see that. And I think leaders need to go into a huddle and question their responsibilities for a more peaceful world and for the rights of people to have an enabling environment to meet their aspirations, their rights. That enabling environment is not here today in our world. And while we make progress, it's insufficient to get ahead of many of the challenges that we have on climate change, on poverty, on inequalities, and of course, as you see, the conflicts. So I would really call to leaders, once you get into that chair, there's enormous expectations and responsibilities. You will be held to account. And I think that, if it's not today, it will be tomorrow. But we need to get leaders to do the right thing. They are voted into office because they will deliver for their people, but they need to come together not just nationally, but in the global village and work together for peace. There is no country that is an island anymore. Our small island states can tell you that. We are all interconnected. So I think leaders need to work towards that. We need to see more women leaders. I think that, it's definitely will change the way we look at things. We look at peace. We look at inclusion. If you had more women at the table, certainly we would get better results and longer lasting responses to some of the challenges that we have today.
What more can the private sector and financial institutions do to help, as you've said, turbocharge the progress towards implementing the SDGs?
Well, the private sector, right at the very beginning of shaping the Sustainable Development Goals, were very engaged. Now, they have made, let me take an example, for COP26 in Glasgow, where we had commitments from institutional investors, well over $100 trillion in commitments. That needs to translate into, into pipelines of programs and projects, transitions in energy, transitions in the food systems that we want to transform, and the digital infrastructure. So more engagement and partnership with the private sector, countries and regions on scale, issues of scale. We're not talking about our pilot projects anymore. We know what works, but we need to see them there in scale. Financial institutions, we need to leverage them. There are the public sector, there is the private sector, and we need to find ways of looking at longer term finance as an investment in peace and development and good for the bottom line, good for your balance sheet. Right now, what we don't have is sufficient de-risking in the market that allows us to go to the medium and long term. It's very short term. Development is long term. It's nation building. It's building people, careers, and countries. So to see perhaps a reset of the financial institutions, the Secretary General has called for looking at the architecture for financing. And I think we do need to do that now for the kind of, as I said, $4.1 trillion per annum on the SDGs is not much to invest in peace. The cost of war is far greater.
And just finally, with all the current crises going on in the world, do you think the target of achieving the SDGs by 2030 is really achievable?
Well, we never give up. We've seen many silver linings in these heavy, dark clouds. One of them, I will tell you, would be the digital. We never put so much financing into that until we found children having to stay away from school, and suddenly we were online. The same thing, can be said right now of the food systems. We are seeing how dependent we are in a couple of countries on a commodity. As we come back better, we will look at a diversification. We will look at production in different parts of the world. Same with the vaccines. So it's how we respond to the recovery that I think will accelerate our achievement towards the development goals. I'm a firm believer that we can still make it, and will not say so till we get to 2030. Then I'll tell you why we haven't if we haven't.
And just personally for you, how heartbreaking is it for you to witness what's going on with the war in Ukraine?
Well, the loss of any one life is just horrific. I have witnessed that in my own country with Boko Haram and the terrorism in the northeast of Nigeria. And so it is tragic. It is no one wins in war. And to see women and children having to flee, to see the devastation of their homes, of their communities, of their world, and that's going to take many years to bring back. It is heartbreaking. It's giving us sleepless nights because we're constantly looking for the solutions to find peace in Ukraine, and of course in many other parts of the world as well, that we struggle to find the peace.
Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me, Tania.